You plan for everything, but nobody planned for this. When a stroke enters your life, the medical team knows exactly what to do. The doctors, the nurses, the therapists, they handle the crisis, and then one day they send your loved one home, and suddenly you're the caregiver. No training, no manual. What we discuss on this show is what I wish someone had handed me on discharge day. Real information, honest conversation with someone who knows exactly what you're going through, because I've been there too. So let's begin the conversation. Good afternoon. Hi, this is Lana with Both Sides of the Bed, and today I'm very excited with our guest that we have. Lauren Yankoff has agreed to join us today. She is a leadership and caregiving strategist and founder of Lead, Life, and Care. She works with leaders and entrepreneurs navigating active caregiving seasons and with organizations who don't want to lose their people. Drawing on 25 years of senior corporate leadership at Victoria's Secret, Target, our favorite store, everyone, and Starbucks, and 6 years of personal caregiving experience with her dad. Lauren developed a stage-informed, system-based methodology and an infrastructure of lead, live, and care. She currently co-hosts Work, Live, and Care, the Triple Shift podcast, with Denise Brown, and partners with organizations including Sanofi on corporate caregiving programming. She believes caregiving is not a work-life balance issue. It's a system issue that can be designed for. Wow, does she have a lot of experience, and I think she's going to bring some great ideas to us. So welcome, Lauren, to our Both Sides of the Bed.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So, before we got online, I was sharing with you that I'm a caregiver. My husband had a stroke, as the listeners know, 5 years ago. And, I dealt with the work-life balance. I still do to this day. And so many of the caregivers and care partners that I talk with and work with have that same issue. So, I would love for you to share a little bit about your recommendations for care partners, a little bit about some of the issues you hear. Just let us know your thoughts on this work-life balance issue.
Absolutely. And, the biggest thing that for me when I was helping care for my dad, he had Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia. I had a really big job. I was traveling 4 days a week. I was a single mom on top of it. And, I think we talk a lot about work and life balance. And what I believe firmly is that we're trying to fit 3 systems into 2. We talk about work and life, but we have this entire care ecosystem that we have to solve for. And we try to fit it into all the spaces in between what we're doing with work and life. And I think about it as like this balloon that kind of takes up all the space until there's nothing left if we don't solve for that.
And
right?
we pop.
And we pop, yes.
Mhm.
And I know for myself, for my mom, she was the primary caregiver. It was incredibly taxing because we were trying to solve for things that we didn't have language for, that we didn't entirely understand. So the work that I do with my clients is I try to take that caregiving piece and create the ecosystem and the infrastructure separately. We look at their work life because you have to create systems for work in a different way than you have before. And you have to create systems for life. So I look at it as a 3-part approach versus just a 2-part approach. Because I think once we do that, we can solve structurally for each of those 3 things in a very different way than if we just did it for 2. And once we can solve for each of those 3 areas, so what you need in care, because you're solving for yourself, but you're solving for your care partner, I think you get a very different dynamic across all of it. And for me, I think one of the biggest things too is when we talk about life, we don't always talk about how our identity shifts throughout the caregiving process, right? And I'm sure you can probably relate because who you were when you started caring and who you are now is so different. And the things that were maybe important to you or that you really needed shift over that spectrum of your caregiving. And I think that identity work is just so critically important. You have to really excavate who you're becoming. And we often tie ourselves to the identity that we were before.
Boy, Lauren, you're absolutely right on that. I find that as a caregiver, you have your before and your after. And I think you go into the after with you're still wanting to give 100% to all three areas. And it's impossible to do, but you wake up every morning trying to do that. And I think that's where we see the burnout that caregivers have. So, you share some of these stages that you were talking about, these caregiver stages. I thought that was interesting, and I didn't know a lot about that, but it resonates.
Yeah, the caregiver stages I think are so important. And that's something I learned through the consulting training that I went through. Though I've adapted a little bit. Those are really from Denise, who is a partner on my podcast. Um, but the stages, there's 6 of them that we identify, and those stages that you move through are from being expectant, where you just are starting to understand that you're maybe becoming a caregiver. Now, for people like yourself, where it's an immediate, you're gonna step into a different stage, right? So, the stages can be something that you gradually progress through or something that you are stepping into in the middle. But there's an expectant caregiver. There's a freshman caregiver where you're just starting to take on small tasks. For me, with my dad's diagnosis, that was where I kind of stepped into it, right? I was taking on appointments or tasks, things a little bit at a time. You become more entrenched in caregiving. That's typically the third stage where it really takes on center stage. So that might be where you stepped into it with a stroke. Um, it becomes part of your daily life immediately, and you typically feel really stretched thin because you're overwhelmed. You're trying things to see what's working and what doesn't. You are having to let go of things that don't work. You're having to really find resources and the things that are working, and you're trying to figure out how to take care of yourself at the same time through all of this. It's that very overwhelming stage. The fourth stage of caregiving is pragmatic. That's where you get the routines, you are more established, you feel more confident as a caregiver. It's also where you're more there or you're less likely to want to step away because you feel like if you do, things may fall apart. And then the fifth stage would be transitioning. Transitioning is where your care may be shifting or even potentially coming to an end. Decisions are a little bit heavier in this stage. And then the sixth stage, I like to call reflective, because this is a stage where I know I'm in. I'm past caregiving. My dad passed away 3 years ago, and I'm really trying to integrate that experience into what I do next. A lot of people in this stage want to take everything they learned from caregiving and put it towards a very purposeful next step in their life. So those 6 stages are really kind of this arc that most caregivers go through, but you can kind of move through them in different stages. And for example, for me right now too, I have my mom, and she's healthy, she's good, but I'm kind of at those beginning stages again with her.
It's interesting you say that because when my husband had a stroke and, life changes very quickly, you do go through stages. And when I started this and I had written Stroke and the Spouse book, I had talked about different stages, different than those, but very similar in many ways. But I find that going through this is not always linear. You may wake up one day and you're like, I've got this going, I know what I'm doing. And then everything falls apart. And then you're back to a different stage. And I think that can be a challenge. So how do you recommend people kind of go through these stages, or what are some tips in each of these stages to kind of get you to the right spot? And I have learned through just talking to everyone I meet, no one does it the same. Everybody has a different way of doing it.
I love that you said that because it's the caregiving experience for every person is so unique. And it's so important that we honor that because your experience and my experience are completely different. And it is a custom designed experience, right? At the same time, it is a universally human experience that we will all go through at some point, right? We will either all care for someone or need to be cared by someone at some point. But I love that you say that because the things that I believe to be true throughout all of those stages that are important for people are to find community, to find the resources that you need. Now that's hard for people to know where to go. I'm sure I would assume you experience that too, right? I think one of the things
Absolutely. I felt like I was on an island, and that's really why I came up with my foundation, because there were no resources. You were out
yes,
there on your own.
yeah, you get it. Something happens or you get a diagnosis and they're like, "We'll see you in a few weeks or a few months." And you're like, "What do I do next?" So people like yourself, like me, coaches, consultants, we can help to direct that. There are resources in the community out there for that. But finding those resources, the elder care attorneys, the financial planners, care managers, things like that, that's part of the work of that care ecosystem and infrastructure that's so important to put in place. The identity work of understanding that. Um, I feel like community, like I said, community, the infrastructure pieces that I outlined, and it's interesting because I do believe that there is different self-care through each of the stages, and I'm sure that people talk about that, right? I'm sure that, you may have gotten advice through different points of how do you take care of yourself? Self-care is so important. I agree with that. What my caveat is with that is it will look so different throughout each stage, and it will look different for different people because what I feel is self care and what you feel is self care are completely different, right? I listen, I love a good massage. I don't know what you love. What did you love? What felt like self care for you during this process? See? Yep. And for some people, it could be I need to go for a walk every day or whatever it may be, but I think one of the things that throughout all of these stages is we have to tie to what we can do right now, not the version of us. Again, I'm going to go back to we can't go to the version of us before we were caring. Because what happens for a caregiver is we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. And I see this with my clients. They're like, anytime I hear somebody say, well, I should be doing this, I'm like, but what can you do? What do you have capacity for?
That is so true, even with for my husband, the stroke survivor. It's not, he can't do this, but he can now do that. And it's a very important to get past that. What I found, Lauren, too, was that, as a caregiver and going through the different stages and everything, I realized that I was going through a grieving process. And it was very hard to share with others because my husband was still alive. I didn't lose him to death, but it was a death in the relationship. It was a grieving of a lifestyle. Do you find that with your clients that you see, or, what are your thoughts on that? Because it took me by surprise, actually.
Well, there's so much grief. There's so much anticipatory grief, right? As a spousal caregiver, what you just identified, and I actually talked with someone just the other day about this, is the shift in the relationship is significant, right? So you're experiencing a change in a relationship. You're experiencing a change in yourself. You're experiencing a change in what you see in a person you care about. Um, I, you know, and you're experiencing a loss of a life that you worked really hard for too. I think for my clients, because most of them are executive leaders, and they're caring for aging parents, they were expecting, they worked really hard for something. And now that something is really changing and shifting, and they're questioning if that's what they want anymore. And that is a loss too. And very similar to what you said, my identity when I was caring for my dad was tied to my job, and taking time off from that job to care for him, I felt like I was losing part of who I was. It was incredibly hard, even though I wanted to be present every day, even though I wanted to be there. So that loss is very emotional for people, regardless of how it comes. So what you're hitting on, Lana, I think is so important for people to be okay with, and to allow themselves the space to process the grief in so many forms. So that is part of, like, from my philosophy, that life piece, and creating space for new identities to merge, but also one of the hardest things for us to talk about in I think in our culture is death. Now you did not, as you said, your husband was still alive, but for so many of my clients, the inevitable outcome of what they're doing is that their parent will pass. And they know that, and they watch that, and it's not something that is easily shared or discussed as well. So that's a lot of the space and conversation that we have too.
Oh, I believe that. Initially when I started doing this work, my first book was Stroke and the Spouse, and it was really focused towards the primary caregiver. But what I found is the adult children, it's a whole nother area. And that's why I did Stroke and the Caregiver, to address kind of their issues. And what I found is, we're in a society now where we don't all live in the same neighborhood. Um, your kids are in different states. Your love, that's just the way the world is. And so I find so frequently family, at the time of a crisis, everybody rushes in. What can I do? What can I do? What can I do? I'll do anything. Well, in reality, they can't do anything. They have to really, and what I recommend is, to the adult children, you need to go back to your immediate family, have a family meeting. What can you really provide? And then let the primary caregiver know that. So you have those expectations. So do you deal often with the adult children? Because I think that's a real challenge for them. They want to be there for their parents, but yet their parents want them to have a life. It's a very challenging situation.
Yeah, you've nailed it. I mean, that is who I primarily work with. And I think what you said is so important, because one of the biggest things that I work with them on as we're setting up their care is, what role do you want to play and what role can you play? Because those are often very different things, and that can create a lot of tension for them, because they may want to play a very big role in the care, but they may be 3 states away. And so that is not the reality of their situation. And then it's also about, what role does your parent want you to play? Because there are multiple layers to any caregiving situation. And so you have to take always the wishes and the desires of person you're providing care for. That's first and foremost, right? And then what are you willing and able to do? is the next layer.
Well, and then the other thing I think is so important is that be careful and don't do too much for the other person. And the reason I say that is because so many times I'll be working with the family and the adult children are like, well, I'll do that. I'll do that. Mom, you should, you need to give them a sense of independence, because if you constantly tell them what to do, they're going to constantly be calling you. You want to have that respect and that independence. And, the best thing I think, an adult children can say is, I would love to help, but, what can you do? And I'll, add to that, because you're so overwhelmed as a caregiver. Any help is appreciated, but it can be a little much. I always laugh because I tell every family, you're going to get the talk. And they're like, what? I go, yep. You said within about a week, about maybe between a month and 5 weeks, your kids are going to sit you down and give you the talk. And the talk usually is, okay, Mom, you got to stop doing this. We can do this. We can't have two parents sick, the whole thing. And we laugh. And every time I talk to a caregiver down the road, they're like, had the talk. I'm like, yeah, that happens.
I'm guilty of giving my mom the talk.
They all do. It's every adult child. I got the talk. We laugh about it. I'm going to lunch with my friends, even ones that aren't caregivers get the talk.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and here's the thing. That comes from a good place, to your
Absolutely.
point. And that is why I always say, what are you willing and able to do? But it's there. You can't override what their wishes are.
Mm-hmm.
And that is such a critical piece. And, it's interesting because there's some families that I'm working with right now, the adult children, and they're like, but this is how it should be. And I have to I'm like, but is that what your parent has asked of you? Because to your point, if that's not what they want, and that it doesn't matter how much that's what you want. And I think, so to circle back or close this out, one of the hardest things that I support my clients in doing is letting go. And it's letting go of the identity that we were attached to before caregiving came along. It's letting go of wanting to control the outcome of some of these situations, because this is a time where we can plan. And I think planning is important. I think putting, the right legal, medical, financial frameworks in places, it's absolutely critical. But at the end of the day, it is still our parents' decisions. And that is the primary caregiver, if you're the secondary, things of that nature. And really honoring the wishes of the care recipient and the primary caregiver in those. So I really respect what you're saying, because it's not easy for adult children, um, but it is a necessary step. There's a lot of letting go throughout this process.
Everything you said really resonates with me. And so many of the caregivers, these are the things we kind of talk about at support groups and, courses that I give, that sort of thing. So I would love to just give you some time what are some last minute things that you would love to make sure that the listeners walk away from, or their, as Oprah would say, their aha moment that they would like to share? Is there anything that you think like, boy, I wish someone had told me this when I was going through this process?
I love that question. So when I think about my personal caregiving experience, and this is what I try to translate for my clients, we had so much in place. We had legal, we had medical, we had the financial things. And there was still so much we didn't know. So planning and preparation is important. And I encourage people to start that process as early as they can, but it's never too late. And so if you feel like, oh, we missed the boat, you haven't, do it now. have the conversations. Sit your parents down, as Sue says, but find out what their wishes are. Like, have the conversations that you've been avoiding, and, sit down and ask, what do you want your end of life to be? How can I support you in that? Like, as an adult child, I think it's important to have those conversations because you wanna honor your mom and your dad, um, and you wanna be able to help them with that. So, I know we joke about that, but I think from a place of love and respect and dignity, having those conversations can be so transformative. Um, the other thing, I believe that caregiving is one of the most transformative experiences we have as humans. Um, caring for someone, watching someone go through that, going through a very vulnerable experience and being there for them, being present for them. Um, and in whatever way we show up for people, because oftentimes I think we don't know what to do sometimes, but just being there for a caregiver, being present, being someone who they can just be with is so important. So being is a critical skill. Just being. Um, yeah, those are 2 things that I have so many more, but those are 2 things that I think are very important.
Great, great takeaways. I have found the same sort of thing. And, what I learned is when, you leave the hospital, or like you said, you leave the doctor's office and they say, okay, we'll see you in a month. And you go home and you sit and you all stare at each other and like, okay, now what do you do? And, that's kind of been my mission to help, like you, to get through that phase. And, for me, for example, I developed a care partner to care partner course that kind of guides them through, like in different modules, what to do, what to expect, and, that sort of thing. But the one thing that I really, really try to share with everyone is have a plan for when, like for me, when I get sick. Who's going to take care of dad? What medicines he has? Where's everything at? The whole, what do you do when mom's sick? When I have the flu, who's going to make sure he's okay? And have that backup plan. And because you don't want it to be a crisis, you want to be prepared for it. Absolutely. Well, we are getting into our time. My goodness, you just gave us so much wonderful information. I just love that you came on our monthly podcast. We're dedicated to, helping those caregivers, those care partners, and also health professionals to give them a place to send people to understand the next steps. So how would our listeners get a hold of you or hear more about your program, Lauren?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I can be reached at my website is theempoweredexec.com. I can be reached at Lauren at theempoweredexec .com. So that's how they could reach me. And also
Okay.
I have a podcast as well. So
Wonderful.
yes, and we share stories of caregivers who they talk about how they work, how they live, and how they care, and then how that impacts them in the workplace, because we really want workplaces to understand the experience of everyday caregivers and what they could do to shift their cultures and shift the workplace impact to better support caregivers in the workplace. So they can listen to that as well, just like your podcast, which is helping elevate all of the experiences and stories for caregivers, because we need more voices uh, helping to amplify this situation, because we have 63 million people who identify as caregivers, but those are just the people who realize they're caregiving. There are a lot more people out there who are doing it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for joining us on both sides of the bed. I am just so excited for our listeners to get to hear this broadcast. I think they're going to go away with some really Great insights. I love the stages. And, I just love that you're taking a personal experience and bringing it to others that are going through the same thing or could be going through it soon. So again, Lauren, thank you so much. And I look forward to listening to your podcast as well. So thank you for your time.
We'll have to have you on. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'd
Lana.
love to. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Every episode, my goal is simple, that you leave knowing we're in this together. Caregivers don't have to figure things out on their own. My hope is to share the education that you will need and to provide resources of value. If today's conversation helped you, share it with someone who needs it, a family member, a nurse, a friend who's going through this right now. That's how we find each other. I'm Lana. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next conversation. Make sure to stay connected on social media at CarePower Connect and on my website, carepowerconnect.com.